Sometimes in chess, two pawns end up stacked on the same file. These are called doubled pawns. They often look weak, but they can also create chances if you know how to use them. In this video, we'll quickly break down what doubled pawns are, when they are a problem, and how they can work in your favor. Enjoy the video. So what are doubled pawns? Doubled pawns in chess are the type of pawns that are on the same file. Now in this case, for example, we have pawns on c2 and c3, which are doubled pawns. Now there are multiple types of doubled pawns that exist in chess. The worst of them is double isolated pawns. These are the type of doubled pawns that have no neighbors. So in this case, b7 and b6 doubled pawns have no a pawn neighbor, and they also don't have a c pawn neighbor. Now there are also just a very regular double pawns, such as the white pawns that you see on the screen right now. The thing about these types of pawns is that the pawns love to be clumped together. You do not want to be pushing them apart, because when you push them, you create weaknesses. For example, if we were to push this e3 pawn to e4, that would severely weaken the f4 square. You can push f4 and then you still maintain control over these squares somewhat, because you're still able to push the f pawn, but you have to be very careful not to create any weaknesses when you're pushing doubled pawns. And generally, this clump of pawns on the right side is going to be better than this clump of pawns on the left side, because as I said, doubled pawns love to be compact. They love to be together. There are exceptions though. There can be cases where you push these pawns and then they take more space, and that's actually more useful than this weakness. And the weakness on c4, for example, would not be utilized very well. But most of the time, you would like to have these pawns in a clump, such as this one right here. Now there are also two sets of doubled pawns that can be next to each other, and this will create a pawn cube. Pawn cube might look very weak because, okay, what are we doing here, right? This looks very weird, but actually pawn cube is probably one of the strongest and most underrated pawn structures in chess, because it can be used as a shield for the king. Let's say this king was like over here on f8, or these pawns were somewhere over here. The pawns would shield the king greatly, while also providing attacking opportunities. Because of just the sheer amount of pawns that there are, you can just push them and your king will not be weak, because the pawns will always be protecting them. So remember, pawn cube is actually pretty good, and we will talk about this later as well. For now, let's start off with weak squares. Okay, so let's take a look at this position. As you can see, in this position, we have doubled f pawns on f7 and f6. So what does this mean? This means that we have no pawn on the g file, and therefore we are unable to control certain squares. In this case, the square on f5 could be a potential square where this knight can end up, and white can take advantage of this square by putting the knight there. Now, it's very important that we have a light square bishop in this position, and the light square bishops have not been traded off, because we are still maintaining somewhat of a control over this diagonal and over the weak squares that we have in the position. However, if we were to change the position a little bit, let me go to the next chapter and remove the light square bishops. Now the defender of the light squares is gone, and white has a free passage to the f5 square, where the knight is going to land and it's going to be quite active. Luckily for us, we can go knight e7 and oppose that knight, but white has certain ways to circumvent that and still have a slightly better position. And because of our double f pawns, and because of the fact that we have traded off our light square bishops, we are left with weak light squares that our opponents can utilize. Now, if we were to compare this position to this one right here, the light square bishops are still on the board, but the pawn is not on e5, it's back here on e6. In this position, yes, we have less space in the center because we're not controlling these two squares with a pawn. However, we are also more solid. We're controlling the d5 square, we're controlling the f5 square, and there are no weak squares our opponents can utilize, at least right away. This has its its own pros and cons. Of course, more space allows us to control the center better, because in this case, if white sets up the position properly, white might be able to push for d4 and then block out our pieces. And because we don't have a pawn on e5, this could create potential problems for us. On the other hand, we are not allowing any weaknesses. We are very solid, and we can fight the center in some other way, maybe move this knight and push the pawn to c5 or pawn to f5 and challenge the center that way. So we don't specifically need to have the pawn on e5. Let me show you another example where you don't want to be pushing your pawns. We have a position like this. It's black to move here. Let's say black plays this move e5, trying to poke at our center. Now, what do we do here? Do we keep the tension? Do we capture, or do we push? The problem is that if we capture, and also if we push as well, we're losing the control over this c5 square. If we capture, let's say the pawn captures back, we are left with double isolated pawns. This is very bad. If we push the pawn, we don't have double isolated pawns because there's still a d pawn here, but the problem is this pawn is too far advanced, and now we have a weak square on c5, and black is able to plant the knight there and basically have this knight here forever. If a4 is played, black will block with a5, and he will have total, not total pressure, but pressure pretty much forever, unless we trade off our bishop for the knight. And even there, black can go back and defend the knight with the other knight, so he can replace this knight if he has to. Now, because of that, we do not want to be pushing or taking these pawns. Instead, we want to be maintaining the control as much as possible to not allow our opponents to advance further into our position. So be very careful and very aware when it comes to which squares you're weakening when you're pushing your pawns, and especially when you have doubled pawns, because this structure can be dead lost. In most cases, it's going to be dead lost pretty much. So let me move on to another chapter. The worst types of pawns are double isolated pawns because they have no neighbors. Therefore, the squares in front of the double isolated pawns are always going to be weak. In this case, we have two weak squares on f4 and f5. In our case, f4 is a more convenient and a better square. The reason for that is because our opponent has a light square bishop, so putting the knight on a dark square outpost where it's pressuring all the light squares is going to be very useful. So a remaneuvering idea in this case could be something like knight to e1, knight to d3, knight to f4, and then we're putting the knight on a very strong square from where our opponent has a very difficult time trying to deal with our knight. If he wants to oppose our knight, he has to do some mental gymnastics such as this one, and even here I would even go bishop h3 and then maybe move the knight back to avoid trading, and maybe try to trade off my bishop for knight if possible, but of course that's situational, and of course that requires calculation as well. But the main thing is you want to put the knights on really good squares, and the squares in front of the double isolated pawns are pretty much always going to be weak. Now let's move on to the topic of open rooks, and in this position, as you can see, the two queens are looking at each other on b3 and b6. Now it's black to move, and if black were to capture this queen on b3, white would capture back with the a pawn. Now what does this exchange do? This exchange, first of all, opens up the rook, which is very good for the white pieces because white activates the rook without even having to move it. Secondly, this pawn on b3 is very, very useful. Why is it useful? It's because in a couple of moves, after something like c takes d4, e takes d4, doesn't have to be right away, this can happen a couple of moves later, we will get this structure, and the pawn on b3 is controlling some very important squares, mainly the c4 square, but also it can be pushed forward to b4 and b5. So let's say black plays a move like a6, which is a very reasonable move because you have pressure on a7 and you don't want the rook to have pressure there. Something like b4, b5 would be very strong to kick the knight out and also pressure this pawn on a6. Now, of course, this wouldn't happen right away. Both sides would develop. First and foremost, e6, knight to d2, bishop d3. We would get normal development here. But after a couple of moves, b4, b5, kicks the knight out, and the pawn that's doubled on b3 is extremely useful and very, very versatile. Now let's move on to another sequence right here. So here we have the same exact position, but it is from the black's perspective. Let me actually flip the board here. As you can see, it's the same exact position, but in this case, we're going to be looking at it from the black's perspective. So here, instead of capturing the queen on b3, here black can play this move c4 and ask white the question. If white captures on b6, we open up our rook as the black pieces and we have the open a file. Now this doubled pawn is a little bit different because these doubled pawns are also backwards pawns. So for example, after a3, b5, it's kind of difficult to push this pawn forward, or normally it would be difficult to push this pawn forward because of the pawns that are controlling these two squares. However, in this case, we have a tactical shot, which is after knight to d2, we can play b4 right away, and as it turns out, the a pawn is actually pinned. So if c takes b4, we can go knight takes b4, and we get rid of our doubled pawn because this pawn cannot capture back because the rook would be hanging on a1. Now this is also another thing that can happen, but if you wait around and play a move like e6, which is a slight mistake, white will move the rook away, and now this is a very normal backwards pawn, which is not great for the black pieces. So you have to be very quick if you get into a scenario like this to push the b pawn and get rid of it as soon as possible, because this version of the isolated, or not the isolated, the doubled pawn is not as good as the last one. Now let me show you another example. So the last two examples that I showed you were on the queen side, but the open rook case can happen on the king side as well, mainly when there's a tension between bishops. And let's say one side captures on g6, white captures on g6, we can capture back with the h pawn, and this opens up the h file and we can attack the white king. A lot of times white will play h3 or something like this in order to blunt our rook, but in the future, after a couple of developing moves such as, let's say, knight f6, knight e4, and just a couple of moves in general, we can even use this g pawn, our doubled pawn, to attack our opponent and try to open up the h file and try to checkmate our opponent. So even this doubled g pawn is very useful because it opens up the rook for us. So make sure you guys open up your rooks whenever you're doubling your pawns. Now let's move on to the rule of taking towards the center. Now in chess, most of the time when your opponent captures you, such as in the case of bishop takes b6, which pawn do you recapture with? You want to be capturing with the one that brings your flank pawn, which in this case is the a pawn, towards the center of the board. This will double your b pawns. Well, both captures will double your b pawns, but this one not only will open up your rook, but will also bring this pawn closer to the center of the board, and that is what you want to do. You do not want to be doubling your pawns and then also splitting them at the same time by capturing on b6 with a c pawn. That would leave some light squares weak in the center, and these doubled pawns are not really that impressive. That's why you want to be taking towards the center. Now in most cases this is going to be the right move. However, there are going to be some rare cases where you want to take away from the center. Well, for example, in the Spanish opening, if bishop takes on c6, you do take with the d pawn to open up your bishop, open up your queen, but also that's one of the cases where it's a different opening and the things work differently there. But most of the time, whenever you're in the middle game, you want to be taking towards the center of the board. So let me show you another example of this here. For example, if black captures on g3, you do not want to be capturing with the f pawn and then creating a position like this. You want to be opening up with the h pawn and then opening up your rook as well. So let me show you another example, and now I'm going to talk about when the f pawn and the c pawn capture towards the center. So in a lot of cases here, let's say bishop to e6 is played by black. Does white want to capture this bishop on e6? And the answer in this case is no. Why is it no? That's because this f pawn that used to block the rook now no longer blocks the rook. It actually helps the rook because it opens up and there's going to be pressure on f2, and it also controls some very important squares such as the d5 and the f5 square. For example, this knight can no longer go knight h4, knight f5. The pawn is doing a great job of stopping that sequence, and that's why this sort of capture that brings the f pawn closer to the center is not going to be ideal for your opponents. And if your opponents do this, you should be very happy, because you have a little bit more control over the center. And this doesn't just only apply to the f pawns, it can also apply to the c pawns as well. Let's look at the London system here. As you can see, bishop f4, e6, and both sides are just simply developing here, and we do not want to be capturing on d6 with our bishop. Why? Because black can take back with either the queen or the pawn, but taking back with the pawn is also just a very reasonable move, and the squares in the center of the board are very well controlled. So this is not something that benefits the black pieces, or sorry, the white pieces. Okay, now let's talk about breakthroughs. In chess, doubled pawns are notoriously bad at breaking through positions and creating passed pawns. Now, what do I mean by that? The position that you have on your screen right now is the Caro-Kann-Tartakower position. I can show you the opening here. This is how the opening goes. You take with the e pawn here. You can also take with the g pawn. It's just a different opening variation. But the Tartakower is when the e pawn takes on f6. Now, this pawn on f6 and f7 as well, these two pawns are very good, especially this pawn is very good at defending the king. So in any opening and any middle game phase of the game, this pawn is going to be very useful, because if white tries to generate an attack, you can go g6 and f5, block this bishop right here. The knight on f3 is also restricted by the pawn on f6. If the knight goes there, the main move is actually knight to e2, but this pawn is doing a great defensive job when it comes to defending this king. However, the problem is that if the pieces get swapped off in any endgame, white is going to be winning, and the reason for that is because the 4-on-3 on the king side with the double f pawns cannot break through. Now I'm going to show you a sequence of moves here, but these are not going to be the best moves. I just want to highlight the idea. So what white can do in these positions is create a passed pawn with c4 and d5. This just simply creates a very clean and healthy passed pawn. But for black is unable to do so because of the doubled f pawns. What white will do is set up the pawns on h3 and f3, and now you are never going to break through this structure, because let me just show you. F6, it doesn't really matter. If you go g4 and then go g3, that completely locks the position. If you take on either h3 or f3, it doesn't matter which one, white will capture back, and now the two double isolated pawns are once again never going to break through. And this is a huge problem, because it means that even though the material is equal, both sides have equal amounts of pawns, white is effectively up a pawn, because you cannot really say that these doubled pawns mean anything on the board, and that's a huge problem, and white is winning because of that reason. Now there are other examples of this, so let me show you another example. So in this case, let's say we play king to e4, activating our king further. Opponent plays h5, we can go g3, and now these pawns are simply unable to break through. If the pawn is pushed to h4, in this case, we can go g4 and then lock this position down. So two pawns effectively restrict restrict 3 pawns, and if our opponent goes g4, then we can capture on g4, and after our opponent captures back, the doubled isolated pawns once again are not breaking through here, and once again we are effectively up a pawn. Not technically, but effectively we are up a pawn. So let me show you yet another example of this, and this is going to be in the Spanish opening. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and a couple of moves later, we play this move d4, and we go into a position like this. Now, this is fine for the black pieces, because for these doubled pawns, black has the bishop pair, and black is going to be very active. However, closer and closer we get to an endgame, in the endgame, white is simply going to have the winning position because these doubled pawns are once again unable to break through for the same exact reason. You know, we can push all these pawns as much as we want to. However, these pawns are simply never going to break through here, and it doesn't matter what black does on this side of the board, the pawns are completely restricted. So remember that doubled pawns are really bad in the long run if you need a breakthrough and if you need to create a passed pawn. In chess, doubled pawns can be very useful for controlling the center as well. So the position that you see on the screen, we have doubled f pawns here, and this doubled f4 pawn along with the pawn on d4 is very effective at controlling the center of the board, mainly the e5 square and the e5 pawn break. If this pawn was on e3, then black could hypothetically set up some sort of an e5 pawn break after a couple of preparatory moves such as knight to d7, rook e8, e5. He could set that up and get that pawn break. However, with the doubled pawns on f4 and then another pawn on d4, this is almost impossible. For you to set up e5, you would have to set up f6, and that's also quite an inconvenient move to set up, and that's not a great way to continue playing this position. And even if you did, you would be creating some major weaknesses while you're doing all of that. Let me show you another example of this. I will go to this position right here, and this is the stone wall opening, but from the white pieces. So here white is playing the stone wall, and here we are playing this move bishop to f5, putting the bishop on this square where it can be taken. White takes, we take back with the g pawn, and once again we have the doubled pawns on the f file. However, the pawn on f5 and also the pawn on d5, they are controlling this e4 square a lot, and this is actually very, very useful for the black pieces. So remember, you can use the doubled pawns to control the center of the board. Doubled pawns can also be very useful when it comes to opening up G and B files in chess, and in a position like this is the French defense. We can play a move like knight to h6, and here if bishop takes h6, we go G takes h6, and now you might think to yourself, okay, these two pawns, they're doubled isolated H pawns, how can they be good? However, in this case, we have a lot of compensation in terms of having the two bishops and having the dark square bishop, which our opponent just traded off, and also the fact that we have the open G file helps us quite a lot. So in a lot of cases, you can do something like this, go to the H6 square, go to the edge of the board. Well, the idea here is to go to F5, which is a typical idea. Generally, if you can develop towards the center, but in some cases, such as the French defense, you want to put pressure on d4. So knight h6, knight f5 is a typical maneuver, and if your opponents take on h6, then you can simply capture back and you are fine here. You have the open G file, you have the two bishops in the position. Now let me show you another example. So here we have this opening right here. I think this is just a simple Vienna. And after takes and bishop to g2, here black can capture on c3, and we can capture with the b pawn. Remember, take towards the center and also open up the b file. So let's say in this position, black plays a move like knight to c6, we go rook to b1, and the open b file provides us with great pressure on the position, and this bishop and the rook on b1 team up to put a lot of pressure on this pawn on b7. So remember, open BNG files are quite useful, and if you double your pawns and open up these files, it is going to be okay. Now let's talk about the legendary pawn cube in chess. The pawn cube can happen in only a couple of different openings, Caro-Kann Tartakower being one of them. So here, as you can see, white takes on g6, we capture back with the h-pawn, and we have this pawn cube. Now, pawn cube is immensely good when it comes to defending the king, and it is also fantastic when it comes to attacking our enemy's king. And the thing is, there are so many pawns in front of the king that we're in virtually no danger here. We can freely push forward and be completely fine. So for example, after a couple of moves, let's just say bishop to e3, we can push this pawn to f5. Let's say takes, queen to d2. Here we simply continue developing our pieces, trying to bring this knight to e4, which is strengthened by the f-pawn, which we pushed earlier right here. So the thing is, we just want to continue developing here. Knight f6, takes, and after a couple of moves, we're going to be able to put the knight on e4, bring the queen to g6 or h6, and start a massive attack on the white king. So the thing is, doubled pawns are not great when it comes to attacking, but two sets of doubled pawns, which is the pawn cube, is an absolutely fantastic attacking mechanism, because you can just push the pawns forward and be completely fine, and that's pretty much how all the games go. Whenever you have a pawn cube, you just throw them forward and it is totally fine. But this is sort of a meme scenario here. It does happen, and it's actually a legit thing. Like, pawn cube is legitimately very strong, but it's more of a joke. If you get this, by all means attack it, enjoy it. It's a very fun structure to play. If you don't, that's also okay. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know in the comments what kind of videos you want to see. Let me know the topics or any theme that you guys want to see. I will add them to my list. I'm not running out of ideas just yet, but I would love to hear what you guys want to watch as well. That's going to be it for today's episode, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.